Okay, we're going to get started. Go ahead and start time. Okay. All right. Hope everyone had a good lunch and had some good discussions. We have three reasons here that we'll be presenting on this next topic. Our presenters are Mike Hatterley from Reliability First. He is a senior legal and enforcement attorney. In the middle, we have Joe Trumba. He is from CIRC. You tripped me up. He's from CIRC, and he is a legal counsel. And then Kevin Spontak here, he's from WEC, and he's a senior enforcement attorney. So, okay. I'll talk a little louder. So the presenters will be talking about the better. Okay. CIP themes that identified during enforcement filings across ERO enterprise and some best practices.
Hello? There we go. Thank you, Jimmy, for the introduction. As he said, my name is Kevin Spontak. I am a senior enforcement attorney here at WEC, and it's my pleasure to be here, chat with you all today. And I have been in and around the CIP standard since they became enforceable back in 2016. Back then, I was actually still in industry, working in market operations, actually. And even though I was in market ops, CIP touches so much that I was actually dragged into being a project lead for being able to implement how market operations was going to be able to interact with the CIP confidential data. And it's from that perspective that we kind of bring you the CIP themes today. And it's not been 10 years since we have had these mandatory and enforceable standards. And in those not quite 10 years, we have seen tremendous improvement across industry, specifically a rapid and significant maturing of CIP programs, especially when it comes to high and medium impact BE BES cyber assets. And while we have seen that rapid maturing, there are still room for improvement within the CIP program, which is what we're here to talk to you about in these CIP themes. I'm going to throw out some statistics for you, as those are the most funded thing to hear after lunch. And within the WEC footprint, 52% of our current OPRA enforcement actions fall within the CIP sphere. As there's a couple of years there, a little bit more recent one. In 2024, year to date, we have 293 potential non-compliances. Of those 293, 167 fall within the CIP space, and that equates to about 57%. The statistics I'm throwing out here are to show you that the majority of issues that we are seeing within WEC still fall within the CIP space. We are not seeing those major fall downs that so many entities had in 2017, 18, 19. So we are seeing a very rapid maturing of this process for all of you that isn't quite 10 years old, and you all should be applauded for that. That said, when we can track themes at the ERO level, which not just the WEC footprint, but across RF, across CIRC, MRO, and PCC, we do see room for improvement, room for additional maturing. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Mike, who will kick us off.
Hello. Okay, that's better. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. And as Kevin talked about, Obviously we've seen a ton of maturation in SIP programs. I think that's really important to highlight because I think at the outset of when we talk about SIP themes, one of the things we're going to be talking about is areas for growth. And that's sort of by design. We're trying to look for areas of growth, but we don't want to ignore the large and rapid growth that has occurred in the ERO and for applicable entities over the last 8 years since SIP v5 was implemented. So I think that's something really important to highlight, that while we're going to be focusing on some areas for growth today, that doesn't mean we haven't seen robust growth over the last 5 to 7 years implementing and executing SIP programs. So I really want to highlight that off the top. I want to talk a little more before we get into it, just about methodology and how we approached and everyone in the ERO approached the SIP themes report. One of the keys for us, especially in the SIP space, in the OMP space, one of the really helpful things is these are publicly filed items that other entities can get a feel for what violations are happening in other places. You can learn from each other. And one of the challenges, I think, in the SIP space is that we really need to protect your confidential information. We need to protect your systems. And so while you have exposure to your violations, you may not have exposure to some of the other things that are happening across other utilities and challenges that are being faced by others. And so one of the goals of SIP themes, without betraying sort of the importance and confidentiality and security concerns, is to take a broader look and try and give feedback to industry of where we're seeing issues without sort of betraying the underlying confidential information. So as Kevin mentioned, we have about over 55% of violations ERO-wide over the years are SIP-based. It's generally a majority of the violations we see. Obviously, there's a whole spectrum of risk. And we're not necessarily addressing all the low risk violations that we see. This is going to be focused a little more on still some of the more problematic or elevated risk violations. Over the years, about a rough estimate, the ERO intakes over 1,500 violations, or roughly 1,500 violations a year. Obviously, a little over 750 of those are going to be SIP violations. It's a significant majority. We have our day-to-day work, obviously one-on-one, and we're diving in and trying to mitigate items with entities, but this is our chance to look at areas where we have consistent issues. With that in mind, I'm going to sort of pivot here. These are the 4 themes, and I don't know if Kevin touched on this. This is publicly available. It was published earlier this year, I think in August officially. It's available on NERC's website. There's links to all the regional websites, I believe, and WEC folks can be pushed there as well. So if you have any questions about how to access it, let me know. Moving from there, I think and these are the 4 themes. I'll be talking to latent vulnerabilities and performance drift. Joe Trombo will be speaking to insufficient commitment to low impact programs and shortages of labor and skill sets. And then the last sort of item I want to highlight before we get into this is, and I'm going to highlight it again with latent vulnerabilities and start off the top. I think this is a helpful definition for a technical term that we sort of coined or used to communicate this concept, this latent concept. But what we're talking about are these long-standing or high-risk issues, but still narrow, but they evade detection and persist within entity environments where there are challenges with executing internal detective controls, or where a successful internal detective control is effective, but maybe a layered data source or something else disrupts it, resulting in missed vulnerabilities and persistent vulnerabilities. So that's what we're talking about. I think Kevin framed the conversation really well with latent vulnerabilities. When we talk about CIP v5, that was an incredibly difficult transition. And obviously some of it was moving over work that was already being done by entities into a space sort of codified and executed under the NERC standards and requirements, but it was challenging. And from 2015 to 2018, and when we look at prior SIP themes reports, we're seeing much more broad programmatic failures. We're looking at misclassification and assets resulting in significant downstream protections not being executed. We're looking at misses in CIP v5, CIP v7, CIP 10, and settlements addressing all of those things, that huge bundle. What we're seeing now is that evolution, right? And so when we talk about latent vulnerabilities, I think this is ultimately, a really positive development, because we're not seeing those broad programmatic struggles anymore. We're seeing narrow misses where we have to sort of attack underlying issues with internal detective controls and underlying sources. One of the things that I think also will be helpful is the report is structured with sort of discussing a broader theme, and then our goal is to give you a decent amount of examples of case types and types of failures that you'll see, and then some suggestions for addressing them. And these presentations are going to go the same way. We're going to kind of broadly discuss what we've seen, and then some ways to attack these risks. So I think the first There are two examples that we like to use a lot when we talk about latent vulnerabilities. One of them is nested access provisions. We've seen this a lot, and we've seen it with entities, especially in the BCSI space, where they will have either administrative grants or other grants of access that are missed, and often dating back to 2016 and 2017, because the underlying sources and sources being pushed into their environment and their internal controls are not correct. And so that issue just persists because they're never caught. In one case, we had an entity with, close to 15,000 of their employees with access to all of their BCSI for a 7-year period. That's pretty extreme, right? And how is that happening, right? Well, it's because the underlying data source they were using to execute and review their monthly access controls weren't pulling from the right data sources. So you can't really compare and remove access if you're not relying on the right data sources, right? So that's an example of a latent vulnerability where you may have implemented a really thoughtful and useful control, but you didn't validate the underlying data sources. And so it just sort of cascades over time because it's difficult to identify, which is why implementing and then continuing to test and review and revise those controls is important. We have similar examples as well with patching, where entities will rely on incorrect patch sources for devices, and it sort of cascades and builds over time because we have a collection of patches being missed, introducing new and elevated vulnerabilities. So those are two sort of examples of how this can happen. I'm going to move to recommendations here. I think the ERO writ large, and I'm sure WEC and at every one of these, we've been hammering internal detective controls probably since the outset of CIP v5, right? It's necessary. There are thousands of devices at many entities, and they're essential to executing your program on a daily basis. But what we want to see, and I think where we've seen entities be successful, is dedicating resources and dedicating skepticism to their function of their strong detective controls, right? You need to have continuous skepticism, especially as you're introducing new tools, new software, and new items to your environment. A control that worked for a significant period may need to be tweaked, or you may need to think about different data source pulls and items to execute appropriately. So skepticism around your detective controls, continuous testing and reconsideration of whether they're functioning appropriately is essential to sort of source these out. We also recommend putting together, and obviously this is an entity-sized thing. Different size entities have different resources, but for entities with the resources, we do recommend sort of putting together a team of 2 or 3 folks whose role is to occasionally go in and test and make sure it's functioning appropriately, scrutinize what's going on, and actually hunt vulnerabilities or areas where you may not be considering all the necessary sources or data or items like that. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Joe.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joe Tromba. I'm legal counsel at CIRC, and I'm happy to be talking to you all today about the CIP themes report. And I just want to expand a little bit on what Mike said. Mike gave kind of the background of the CIP themes report, and I'm going to use that to kind of segue to this theme, because as I've presented this in the past, one of the main questions I've gotten is, this is version 3 of the report. And with the previous reports having come out in 2015 and 2018, why the gap between 2018 and 2024? Why did it take so much time to get the 3rd version? And the way I like to go about answering that is that this is very much an evolution, like Mike was saying. And as these 4 themes started to show themselves to us when we were researching and drafting the report, I think this is a theme specifically with insufficient commitment to low impact programs that illustrates why it took so long between the 2 versions. This is a theme that has been increasing year after year, and it makes sense, right? So insufficient commitment to low impact programs, what are we talking about? We're talking about a entity with low impact assets or low impact facilities where they're not giving enough time, resources, or efforts to their low impact areas. And there's a few different reasons why. And one of the main reasons arguably being that as time goes on, the bar continues to be raised with low impact facilities and assets. And because of that, we've seen the number of non-compliances ERO-wide start to go up and continue to go up year after year. And not only that, but then there are some cases where entities, much larger entities, might have low impact areas to their program where it's just a certain part of their program. They're not entirely low impact. And in those cases, what we've seen is it can often be thought of as an afterthought. The low impact obligations boil down to a list of check the box activities at times in those cases. So there are a number of different reasons for why this theme exists and why it continues to go up as time goes on. So an example of the way we see this in cases, and it's kind of a two-part example in that we've seen entities struggle to apply security plans, create security plans, and then make sure those security plans are implemented consistently on a long-term basis. And there's two parts there, right? Because there's the failure to create a plan at all, right? There's that either it's an oversight or for whatever reason, it's that failure to create a plan. And then there's the struggle to make sure it's implemented consistently on an ongoing basis. And I liken it to, and I'll be saying this same expression when we get to theme 3, is the what and the how, where maybe they did figure out the what, security plans in place, but they overlook the how. How will this be implemented consistently on an ongoing basis? And that's where you see a lot of the struggle come in here. And ultimately, if there's one thing you can kind of take out of this theme, it sort of boils down to awareness and the entities struggling with their low impact environments to have an awareness. Another example is we've seen entities not even know at times what's coming in and out of their own cyber environments, or they may have said that they've done something, but they have no evidence to show that they did. And it boils down to awareness and possible oversight in those instances. And when it comes to recommendations, the main recommendation here is arguably pay attention, improve attention to detail, right? Review your compliance programs, make sure that your low impact areas have the resources, the staff, the time, make sure these are getting the resources they need to be able to exist and function on an ongoing basis and to basically give them the attention that they warrant and they need. So with that being said, I'll go to theme 3, which is shortages of labor and skill sets. This is arguably the most expansive theme. So for our purposes today, I'm going to be going through 3 different examples that illustrate what this theme looks like. And this is a theme that, I mean, this is even beyond beyond our industry, right? This is just a big issue right now that transcends different industries. But when we're talking about our industry, the 3 examples I'm gonna say, the first one is that entities will lose staff either due to retirement or termination or just seeking employment elsewhere. And the entities either fail to adequately or sufficiently transfer that employee's job responsibilities to somebody else, or maybe they do it, but they transfer it to somebody else without the experience or the knowledge to be able to handle those job responsibilities. And the second example, which is kind of similar to that, is what entities are struggling with hiring and retaining skilled, knowledgeable workers. And then lastly, the third example I'll say is that entities have been implementing new processes, controls, or technological solutions, and they've been overlooking the staffing component of these new processes or controls. Again, the what and the how. They focus on the what, that they overlook the how. How will these new processes or controls be implemented on an ongoing basis? And that brings me to the big example that I'm going to use for this theme, where we saw a case where an entity spent a lot of time and a lot of money, resources in crafting this new technological solution for their entity. And they spent so much time focusing on the what and perfecting the solution, making sure it would work for their environment, that they overlooked the staffing component. And when they implemented it, they had overlooked how this will be utilized on an ongoing basis. They were focused on just implementing the solution. And they overlooked, does the staff need training? Does really what staff is needed? How many staff are needed? And what resources does staff need? Do they need additional controls to help implement this thing? Do they need, as I just mentioned, training? They overlooked all those questions when it came to implementing this new control, that it led to a number of SIP-related issues. So how do you address shortages of labor and skill sets? Well, as I mentioned, this is arguably the most expansive theme. So with that, it's also where you can sort of be the most creative, and it depends on the certain issue that you're dealing with, but we'll just take the three that I mentioned. The first one being you lose a skilled, knowledgeable worker because of retirement or seeking employment elsewhere or termination, whatever the reason may be. Implement a succession plan. No matter who the employee is, try and imagine what life would look like without that employee, right? And make sure that you have a plan in place for if that person's going to retire. And even at times, entities will say, yeah, we knew they were going to retire. We just didn't want to imagine what life looked like without them. I understand that, but that's also part of the problem here is you do at times, because without imagining what life looks like without that employee, you're setting yourself up to almost play catch up when that person leaves. So implement a succession plan. And with that being said too, if you know especially that that employee of yours is maybe nearing retirement, see if your skilled, knowledgeable workers will help mentor or share their knowledge and experience with other staff. So that way you can help spread that knowledge about that specific employee's job responsibilities and tasks with other staff while you still have them. You can help utilize that experience for your staff. And then as we get to the second example with struggling to hire and retain skilled, knowledgeable workers, you may want to revisit your recruiting efforts. Are there any recruiting efforts? Maybe you want to start recruiting from high schools, to colleges, to job fairs. And then when it comes to the third example, it comes back to what I've said with these past two themes, is the what and the how. When it comes to implementing a new control, solution, process, think about how this will be implemented on a consistent basis, and ask yourself the important questions such as, what staff is needed for this? How much staff are needed for this? And do they need anything from us? Do they need anything from the entity to help them be able to do that on an ongoing basis, such as training, or maybe they need their other tools, or maybe other staff, or whatever the case may be. What do they need to succeed? And with that being said, I'll hand it back over to Mike for theme 4.
So another item I want to highlight, earlier I was talking a little bit about the importance of your technical and internal controls, but with these last two, one of the things that we're talking about a lot is the fact that we really can't strip out the human element from executing these important jobs. You know, the people executing these programs, there's a human element, and we can design really important and effective controls, but we have to also make sure we understand and price in the human element that we're trying to manage. And you're going to see that happen a little more here in performance drift. So, you know, I think this is the most simple one to understand. The examples are the easiest, right? This is a fundamental requirement that dates back to the start of NERC. We have to physically protect our most important assets. You know, we've heard about it becoming more and more complicated when we talk about the CIP14 space and those additional layers. But, you know, from the very start, physical security is essential to protect and avoid misuse. And one of the things that sort of concerned us in this last category is just sort of the slippage or sloppiness that can occur with the human element around physical security. There's a lot of ways in which individuals executing tasks repetitively, and this is a task we've had to execute for 15, 20 years beyond that to protect these assets. But executing these security controls is incredibly important, and the processes in place are important, but that can be hard to execute when you have humans executing them every single day. So we have a lot of examples and a number of cases of staff letting individuals into PSPs because they told them they forgot their badge, even not knowing the person, and letting them into this PSP. We have examples of people letting them into vendors into medium and low impact sites, letting individuals who posed as vendors into low impact sites and not being actual vendors just because they had that expectation. They drove a truck that looked like a vendor truck. Let's let them on in. And so this is sort of the slippage or apathy and circumvention that we're seeing. We have a lot of prop doors. We have a lot of ignoring alarms, and in that one's that's really concerning to us too. You can have really important, once again, controls in place. Are you paying attention to your alarms? Are you acting proactively with those beyond just the basic responsibilities? And then finally, I think one of the things we realized in reviewing all these cases and in collaboration with others, and as this theme developed, is, ideally entities are not fostering an environment where people are substituting individual judgment calls in the place of security protocols. These security protocols and policies, they drive me, they're challenging at times. And I think being a person working in an organization with very similar security protocols, it can be really challenging to execute them and rely on them every day. But that's the challenge and the nature of our work. And so that's one of the things that we have to really make sure we're not allowing individual judgment calls, like letting someone who who might have formerly worked at the organization into a PSP or have access to cyber assets or, any number of other things. So that sort of substituting of judgment is a real danger for us and something that we can't have. When it comes to recommendations, the fundamental one I want to hit on is we're having such a large issue and instance count with these that we really think the most valuable thing is doing some penetration testing, and physical penetration testing locally has been a huge value for us and value for entities. And then communicating it. I think it's really easy to do physical penetration testing and say, hey, we passed, or hey, we failed, and move on. Communicate where you were successful, communicate where you failed, and attack those risks. But we really recommend that you perform physical penetration testing and then other security testing throughout the year, and do it consistently. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Kevin to wrap this up.
So as I was originally reading CIP Themes report back in August when it was officially published, what kept coming to mind is my absolutely favorite phrase, which if you haven't heard me say it, you're lucky, but it is: compliance is the natural outcome of robust processes, procedures, and internal controls. And I can look at every single one of the themes that we presented today, and I can point to a failure of one of those. And take a look at latent issues, detective controls. They're hard, especially when you have to look back 9 years ago, 8 years ago, and find out where the issues are. Taking a look at performance drift. You have the process in place. You have the procedure that dictates how the process is going to be put into place on a daily basis. But then you need to build controls on top of that. The preventative controls to make sure the door doesn't open. The detective controls to make sure that if the door opens, we have the alarm and we can actually review it. So while it's an easy saying, I don't think I have to tell anyone in the room that it's a very difficult thing to implement. And it is a testament to how far we have come, how quickly, which leads me to my second point. Yes, we've come very far, but there's always that need to drive to perfection. We may never reach there. The destination of perfection may be unattainable, but driving towards that, continuously improving what we're doing on a daily basis or a monthly basis, and looking at how our processes exist, how our procedures exist, whether our controls are targeting the right spaces within not only the CIP program, but the OMP program, and the reasons behind those being the reliability and security of the BPS. There are always ways to drive towards that improvement, even if perfection is never achieved. So with that, I will once again point out that this is a publicly available report. I am not sure if it's on the website. I will take an action item to verify it is there. In the meantime, you can just Google it, but I will make sure I talk with the people, get it up on the website as soon as possible. And I do suggest reading over it. Yes, we went over it. Yes, we gave you some details. We're happy to answer some questions on it. It's a quick read, it's a good read, and it's worth your time. So with that, we will open it up for questions.
Lenin Martin Smart. I'm asking this question on behalf of Jenny from Tacoma. Just kidding. Yeah. So, as a system operator, you require NERC certified operation training. For other jobs, like an auditor, you need an auditor certification, and so on and so forth. So why are we not thinking about, as a CIP SME, to have some required training, right? That's required before you can become a CIP SME to do the job.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And, I mean, one, like entities, I'm trying to, is it CIP 4 that requires certain like personnel and like cybersecurity training? I mean, that's a starting point, but obviously, yeah, it's a different than a certification as a system operator. I mean, I think one of the challenges you run into is, we're talking about shortages of skill sets here, which is a significant challenge. And for entities filling staffing, especially with network security and other items, it's been a huge challenge. And so getting people in the door is a challenge enough that like creating that additional level of having this certification just to have to work in a CIP program, especially with a lot of cybersecurity principles being overlapping in the CIP programs and outside to secure your environment. I mean, it's definitely worth considering. And it's something worth talking about, but I'm not sure, if it creates too much friction in that regard.
Okay, understood. And also the report is available on the NERC website.
Oh, there we go. I'm going to also jump in there and just throw some kudos to the presentations from this morning. Yes, standards are a very useful tool. They're not necessarily the hammer for every nail. And whether requiring some sort of certification for some level of CIP access makes sense. That's a very big question. And as we learned about SARS all through this morning, that's, if you really believe it, seems like a good place to start.
Hi, Stephanie Little with Arizona Public Service Company. I know this is specific to the report that was generated, but I'm just curious on the performance drift. This was specific to physical security. Are you seeing a similar theme start to pop up on the cyber side of the house?
That's a great question that I think, that's a really good question. I think the fingerprints of it are harder to see on the cybersecurity side. I think the fingerprints of sort of apathy or circumvention when it comes to physical security is much easier to see because they're much easier to understand as examples. I think when you see those sort of things occur in sort of network security or other important, cyber environments, I think it's a little harder to identify and find those fingerprints, but I wouldn't doubt that it's there.
Hi, Monica from CAISO. Thank you for sharing this information. A couple of questions. One on the drift and the physical security and the circumvention of controls there. What are your thoughts on, coalescing that or comparing that with like safety issues? Because in some of the reviews I've done, I've noticed that, there's a much of a bigger impact that individuals have when there's a safety issue in propping a door open, for example, versus, oh, we're just doing this for a compliance reason.
I think that's a great point. That's the classic prop door hypothetical. And I'd like to isolate it as that's one of the lower risk activities we see in circumventing these things. And yeah, I think you're right. I mean, and there are ways to execute that in your program to still secure the door when you need to do it for safety needs. So I agree that, I think that's a necessity and I think you have to balance those items. Yeah.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, what you see a lot with performance drift is staff accepting a certain level of risk, sometimes based on trust. And they don't think of those implications because it might be something, as Mike said, they do how many times every day for a period of years. Sometimes the importance of the act itself can get lost. on staff. And that's why another recommendation, Mike might have mentioned it too, but one of the recommendations in the report is to just do training or awareness activities, remind staff routinely, regularly, why the acts themselves matter, why it might look like a small, simple, mundane task, but why it matters in the bigger picture. And there are plenty of real world examples out there that can help illustrate that fact.
And my second question is, I know this is related to the report, but any thoughts on emerging risks like that we see from vendor side of things with supply chain, cloud, things that really kind of are outside of our control, and how do we implement controls in that space?
So I'll start us off here, and I'll go back to theme 2 for that too. And I had started that one off with saying that this is a theme that we just see getting more and more as time goes on. And we expect that to continue because so the report tries to avoid mentioning certain standards or requirements for most of these themes, but it doesn't do that with theme 2, insufficient commitment to low impact programs. It does mention CIP 3, and there's the new version coming out. I know there's version 9, and then I think there's even talk of the 10 and so on. But there are new versions of CIP 3 coming out that are continuing to raise that bar. So we're talking about emerging risks. I would still go back to insufficient commitment to low impact program, because I think that's one that will continue to evolve, and that bar will just continue to get higher and higher.
Yeah, to Joe's point, we also have the most new players there. A lot of our low impact that we're talking about are a lot of new players, new generators, right? And so we have people who are often completely new to the NERC CIP space. And I think that's where we're going to continue to see those challenges. And we also have it happen with some of our entities with medium and highs, but that's where I see that growth. You know, on the supply chain side, I think it's one of those things that we reviewed a decent number of cases, but I think we're still getting a feel for how entities are handling it, right? This is a relatively new standard. And this activity was trying to take a look at, you know, what we've seen and what we're learning from the cases we're seeing. I think there's still a lot for us to learn on the enforcement end about what's happening in that, you know, especially in the CIP 13 space.
Thank you. No, please.
So for me, I'll just go back to the changing and evolution of the grid. And especially when we talk about new certifications and the new certification projects going with IBRs, that is going to open up a brand new can of worms. And when I think about it, I think about all of the implications that could have, and how those risks will be managed by not necessarily folks with the expertise around those, and how those could potentially bleed over into neighboring entities, et cetera. So I think as we, as an industry, continue to evolve and grow, especially within the IBR space and renewables, it is going to evolve how we look at security, especially within the low impact area.
Thank you. Thank you. Patrick Miller, Ampex Cyber. How will these themes directly affect your audit approach for these areas?
Well, thankfully, we're enforcement, so we don't have to worry about that.
How about your enforcement approach?
I'll go ahead and start that. So we talk. All right, the members of CMAP, we speak. We work to be one cohesive group. So these CIP themes being public and being known and being seen across the ERO, including the WEC footprint, it will be on the radar through the IRA and the COP process. Now, whether these insufficient resources for low impact CIP 3 gets brought into scope or not, that will fall onto the individuals creating the compliance oversight plan, and then of course fall to the monitoring pod, who then creates the audit scope. So I can say that, yes, these being public, you all knowing about these themes, which I hope you take seriously, will be another piece of information going into the filter that will become your compliance oversight plan and audit scope, it will not necessarily drive it, and it will be very dependent on your entity, as it should be.
And it also comes back to communication and visibility. So when it comes to the 2018 report, we saw a lot of great response to that report and almost an evolution based on what was identified in that report. So for example, one of the themes in the 2018 report was something along the lines of inadequate controls. And when you read that and then read lane vulnerabilities in this report, it makes sense for why this one would be identified, right? Because entities start to respond to the 2018 themes, and in doing so comes these more nuanced, narrow themes that you see in the 2024 report. So for lane vulnerabilities, yeah, maybe they put in controls, but maybe there was a gap in one of their controls. Maybe there was a gap here that wasn't being caught. So it's that response to the 2018 report, which kind of gave us the more narrow response here. But something that we've been doing with this report as well is that we've been giving and we offer and we vocalize, we're happy to give private briefings based on the report. I know we've given it to entities in our respective regions, and whenever we present on this or talk about this, we always present that opportunity to come give private briefings to teams and entities, because that's part of it, right? We spend so much time in researching and drafting and creating this report, and now it's the outreach. Now it's communicating this and making sure that we can have these conversations, because that's how that drives change.
I think one last thing to add would, at least for me, and I know there might be some folks with assets in multiple regions, but I think for us, a couple of these are sort of influencing how we're attacking some of these risks and some of our audit strategies. I mentioned a case in the latent vulnerabilities section about not properly capturing the access inputs. I mean, that's something that we're thinking about how to attack those when we audit entities' access programs and making sure we're attacking and helping them consider those. And Joe mentioned it. CIP3. As we continue to see challenges and new players in that space, I think the oversight in that space is going to be significant. And it may not be, large compliance audits. It may be targeted spot checks to make sure you're executing important physical and cyber controls, making sure you have a coherent program in place. So, I think to that point, that bell has kind of been rung from a CIP3 perspective.
And I'll add on just one last thing to that, which is that some of these ideas in this report aren't necessarily unique to this report. When we've spoke with stakeholders or entities about this, a lot of entities have said, yeah, that makes sense. Or, oh, it's good to know that we're not the only ones experiencing these issues. And I can speak for CIRC when I say that in CIRC's perspective, it was in one, theme 3, shortages of labor and skill sets, was in one of CIRC's recent regional risk reports. So as I mentioned, some of these ideas aren't unique to the report in the sense that this report both informs and reflects other conversations that are happening in this space as well.
We do not have any questions from the online audience, so thank you. We appreciate you taking the time to give us this panel conversation around the CIP themes report. We will take a short break and transition to our next session and start that at 2 p.m.